I'll go ahead.
Yep, keep going.
So,
Go on.
as Robert mentioned, I'm from the School of Biological Sciences at Waipapa Taumata, the University of Auckland, and my main research interest is plant ecophysiology, so understanding how plants respond to climatic conditions in particular. And that's really important when we think about things like forests, because we are assuming that forests will take up carbon for us and provide a solution to climate change. But if under future climates they're not going to take up as much carbon, or they're not going to survive extreme conditions, then we need to understand that so we can really get a good handle on what kind of solution forests might be. So that's my main area of expertise. I've also kind of expanded a bit more broadly to get into thinking about biodiversity and climate change in general, because it's a bit of a gap that we have in the kind of knowledge system here in Aotearoa. So you might have noticed I've got a bit of an Australian tang. So I grew up in Sydney, and we moved over here in 2010. So very much kind of feeling like we're Kiwis. We are dual citizens, and my kids are now 14 and 16, and given they were only 3 and 1 when we arrived, they're very much Kiwi kids. But the really interesting thing about moving across from Sydney in 2010 was that already in Australia there was a lot of climate change and biodiversity research going on. Came here, went to the Ecological Society conference in 2011 and started talking about climate change, and some of the big names in ecology said to me, we don't need to worry about that. We have a very maritime climate. It's pretty mild, already quite variable, so we don't kind of worry too much about climate change. And that's an issue because these big names actually prevented people from getting into climate change research. So we're very much behind the kind of rest of the world, and Australia in particular. Now, you might say, well, we don't have kind of much going on, but I'm going to show you some examples of what we do have going on that we kind of haven't picked up because we haven't really been looking that much. Now, Robert also mentioned the IPCC. I was contributing co-author on Chapter 11 of the Working Group 2, which is about the kind of impacts parcel of work. And so Chapter 11 is Australia and New Zealand. So Judy Lawrence kind of led the New Zealand side of things. And then there were a lot of Australians, and it's a big team. I think it was about 50 of us contributing to that chapter. And it's really interesting when you see the information together on Australia and New Zealand, very much data deficient here in Aotearoa. But there's a lot of work going on to try and address that now. And that's a lot of the sort of stuff that I'm doing and going to talk about today. So let me just whiz through a few slides. Oh yeah, I've just got a slide here showing this is a drought experiment that I've been working on for the last 5 years. What we've done is just put some skirts on trees to simulate drought in the forest, and then we're looking at how the plants respond to that. So just to give you an idea of the kind of research that I do, and here's a picture of me up in a tree 15 metres up in the air doing measurements on leaves. So that's kind of my core research area. But as I said, I've kind of broadened out into climate change more generally. So what I wanted to do in this talk is talk about kind of some of the general concepts and then dive into some of the details of what's happening here in Aotearoa. So if we talk really generally, this is a diagram from a paper that is getting a bit of feedback there. It was published about 10 years ago. And it's just talking about these general concepts of what's happening in terms of climate change and biodiversity interactions. I'm sorry, the text is a bit small, but what this shows here is a list of a number of different climatic factors that will be changing into the future. And so this includes temperatures, rainfalls, extreme events, carbon dioxide concentrations, and also things going on in the ocean. So it's kind of a complete set of what might happen. And then we can talk about the different biodiversity components that can be influenced from that. And this includes ranging from the very tiny, so the genetic material, all the way down to kind of what's happening at the global scale in terms of biomes. So there's a lot going on around genetics, physiology, phenology, so that's the timing of flowering and fruiting and those kinds of things, so sort of ecosystem dynamics, distributions of different species, interspecific relationships, how the species are interacting with each other, productivity of communities, so things like carbon uptake in forests, and then other ecosystem services, which may include things like sort of water cycling and other processes, and then finally, as I said, kind of global scale type processes. So what this diagram shows is that there's a lot of different climatic factors, and there's also a lot of different biological factors. So there's lots of potential for climate change impacts to be occurring across ecosystems, species, and all kinds of ecology. And then the next diagram that I like to show is sort of talking about sort of the consequences that we might record or measure. And this one's just got kind of 4 main categories here. So this is from another paper also about 10 years ago, but it's just talking about what might happen in terms of the severity of impacts. So the first one there we've got is toleration. So when we have a change in climate, the organisms will kind of potentially tolerate that. They'll be able to remain in that space, but they might be, we see plants becoming a bit stunted, or they're not growing as fast, or they don't look quite as healthy. So that's the sort of toleration range. The next one is a habitat shift. Maybe if we think about sea level rise and mangroves, we might see mangroves moving further up the shore. Okay, so habitat shift is just a small movement of that particular species. The next one on the list is migration, and then this is where we get a large-scale shift. The classic example of that is in the Northern Hemisphere. We're seeing boreal forests migrating north. So as the kind of the Arctic thaws out, these forests are able to move closer to the North Pole. And then the final one there is extinction. So this is when there's nowhere else to go. Extinction happens first at a local scale. So we will see populations dying out, and then eventually, like the whole species can go and become extinct. So a lot of the research about 10 years ago was focusing very much on the extinction side of things, because that was the big issue. But actually we know that even at the toleration stage, that can be really important to understand, because like I said, if we're thinking about things like carbon capture and storage, that's ecosystem service will be reduced under kind of climatic conditions that are not favourable to that. So potentially a lot going on. And then the final kind of overview slide is thinking about how we might measure these things. So there's lots of different ways, things we can measure, and things that we can do in terms of both understanding what's happening in the real world and predicting what might happen into the future. So this slide has a collection of different things we can look at. I'll just have a quick look at that. So the first one here is direct observations, and this is a pretty obvious one where we can actually go out in the field and do recordings of what's happening. A classic example of this is in the UK. There's a decades-old collection of observations by kind of enthusiasts on butterfly distribution. So people go out in their gardens, say, look at butterflies, what's there? And what they found is that there's kind of a northward advance of a number of different butterfly species as the temperatures have grown warmer. In the UK, species are kind of shifting northward. So this is kind of a direct observation that's really easy to understand. The next thing I've got here, what's going on? Okay, the next one is paleoecological records. And this is when we kind of look at what happened in the past. Let's look at past climates, what happened in terms of the different species responding to those. That's a really useful resource because it's kind of a record that we can tap into and think about, but it's got limited application under current climate change because we're in what we call as a new analogue. So we're in conditions, the rapid changes that we're seeing now is not something that's occurred in the past. So the paleoecological records, there's less emphasis on using those now than say about 10, 15 years ago. And then the final one here is climate envelope models. And this is where we look at the distribution of a particular species. And we look at the environmental conditions there. And we think about how that might change in the future and think about where that species might shift to. So this is kind of observations of what's happening right now and then thinking about projecting into the future. So all three of these are kind of empirical observational. They're all about kind of recording things that are already in the record. And then down the bottom here, we've got mechanistic processes. So we might use, say, for instance, ecophysiological models. An example of this is in my own work, when I'm doing my drought experiments, I then use models to think about projecting what the information I'm recording in my drought experiment will mean under future climates. So the ecophysiological models are all about capturing what we know about the ecophysiological responses to climate, and then we can think about future climates and what that means for how the plants or animals or whatever we're working on might operate. Next, we have experimental manipulations. So this is often glasshouse trials or other kinds of experiments where we simulate future climatic conditions and look at what that does to the organisms. And then the last one on here is population models, which is about looking at sort of how the populations might fit together and what they might do. So these mechanistic ones are really important because they allow us to kind of do future projections about thinking about what might happen. And then we can kind of do some planning to decide what interventions we might be able to put in place to prevent that possible. But in the New Zealand context, we're kind of way behind in terms of these mechanistic approaches. So a real big need for more research there. And I just want to highlight too that for the IPCC reports, they very much focus on the direct observation. So most of the material reported in the IPC is about these are things that are happening that we can record in the field and we can attribute to climate change. There's not as much thinking about kind of the future projections because that is a different kind of stream of work. Okay, so I'm sure you know quite a lot about this, but it's always nice to just sort of run through what the projected changes are for Aotearoa. So I've got 2 slides just highlighting the main things that are going to happen if we project out to 2090. Okay, so air temperature in the best case scenario will increase by about 0.7 degrees on average, and under the worst case scenarios, maybe even 3 degrees. The air temperature extremes, though, will see an increased frequency of very warm days. So these are heat waves, and obviously we'll have a different distribution of those around the country. Aotearoa is highly patchy in terms of future climates, but in some areas we'll get pretty warm. Hilariously, we define a heat wave in Aotearoa as being higher than 25 degrees because apparently that is the temperature at which cattle become heat stressed. So be interesting to redefine that because heat waves are actually really relative to what the kind of normal conditions are in an area. So if we think about somewhere like Sydney, 25 is not a heat wave. And so there's some approaches looking at how we better define heat waves as being kind of a statistical anomaly above the average temperature. Anyhow, we've got 25 degrees for now. And then sea surface temperatures are going to increase. Sea level rise, we know, is something that we're kind of already seeing if you live anywhere near Tamaki Drive and seeing that. And the other kind of roads close to the water around Tamaki and Koro. And then the sea level rise is actually new information is showing that this Antarctic shelf ice sheet process is, we're actually possibly underestimating the potential sea level rise. So some new research there that's really a little bit alarming. And then just one more slide on this. So thinking about water and fire, so rainfall, what we're going to see is a real change in the distribution of rainfall, and this includes sort of both droughts and floods. And so if we just look at the average rainfall, think about a year like 2020, there were the droughts occurring just as we went into lockdown, but then there was some substantial rain after that. So the rainfall for the whole year was actually pretty average, but it was distributed in a way such that there was a drought and then a flood. So these changes in the rainfall regimes are going to be a big issue. Droughts, we're already seeing an increased prevalence of those. Certain parts of the country more prone. What we say generally is that the drier parts of the country will get drier and the wetter parts will get wetter is what's happening under future climates. Now then, fire weather is a really big one, and that's obviously associated with drought somewhat, but it's also associated with the heat waves, and the kind of wind is really a problem for fire. And so you can imagine if we've got a drought, that dries out the vegetation and becomes more flammable. So I've got a collaboration with a colleague in Lincoln looking at how that works. And then finally, snow, we're seeing a decrease in both the number of snow days, but also the distribution of snow. And so skiers not very happy about that. So what you can see here is we've got lots of different things going on. So lots of potential for impacts into the future. How do we kind of work out where to look at those? Oh, and I should also mention the glaciers. So really considerable retreat of the glaciers. That's even, just measurable within a 10-year period. So that's future stuff, but we know that climate change is here and now as well. So these are the not sure if you've seen this, show your stripes, but you can go onto this website and put a location in the world and it shows you the stripes for that particular location. And so this is the stripes for New Zealand, and the blue colours are sort of the less than average temperatures for the year, and then getting into the pinks and reds is the higher than average. And so you can see there's a trend towards obviously warmer temperatures. There's a bit of variation, so it's not a really as clear a pattern as it is in other parts of the world, but definitely obvious that climate change is here and now. And this is another diagram that shows that. This is from the NIWA New Zealand Drought Index. So if you want to look this up, you can Google New Zealand Drought Index, and they have real-time data on, there's a map of the country and it shows you what regions are in drought. And then you can also choose a region and it gives you a plot going from 2007 when they started this through to the current time. So what we've got here is this peak here, extreme drought. This was the 2020 kind of February to April period. And then this period here is the current summer that we've just had, a bit of an overload of rain. So obviously we're not in a drought at the moment. But every year in Auckland, we sort of have this kind of, well, most years we have kind of a dry period during summer. And those are obviously getting worse. That 2021 was pretty bad. And that means that we've got impacts that are happening on plants. A lot of the stuff that the climatic impacts that we expect is just really anecdotal at the moment. So we don't have all of this recorded in the literature. But these are just some of my own photographs that I took during lockdown and also just after the lockdown finished. Lots of different plant species obviously wilting because of those dry conditions. Most of them wouldn't have died, but they will definitely be kind of suffering. So they're in that sort of toleration type situation. But some of the plants, did die. So the kawa there in the top row, those plants didn't survive. Okay, so I've mentioned the IPCC. This is the information about the report, and I'm happy to share these slides too, so you can get all of the links off those if you want them. But let's have a look at what kind of species and impacts have been reported in this report that just came out in November last year. Now, remember that they've got really strict criteria around the fact that the information has to be peer reviewed and already published, and even had an argument with Judy about some that were kind of in press and trying to get some papers over the line so they could get into the report. So for terrestrial systems, we can identify a few kind of vulnerabilities. So alpine birds in particular are influenced by this process called thermal squeeze. So what's happening is that as the temperatures warm up, the invasive predators are advancing to higher elevations. And this means that the refugia for the birds, there's fewer refugia for the birds. And so the birds are not able to kind of get away from the predators quite so easily. So this is particularly a problem for larger body birds that nest in tree cavities because the kind of stoats and rats can get into those cavities. And if they're poor dispersers, then they sort of don't have ways to recover from that. So alpine thermal squeeze is a kind of well-established process that's a little bit complicated, but we know that it's a problem for these birds. Coastal ecosystems, as you can imagine, lots of erosion going on, cliffs and dunes, and as we see these more intense storms and sea level rise, they're very, very vulnerable to that. And then another kind of well-known process and concept is the beach forest ecosystems where we have masting events. So these forests kind of produce a whole lot of reproductive material in certain years, and that is really strongly stimulated by the climatic conditions. And so as temperatures warm, the masting events happen more often, and those masting events provide a whole lot of food resource for rats and some other pests. So when a mast event happens, a huge explosion of rat populations, and then when the food source is all used up, the rats switch to birds and eggs and invertebrates and all kinds of other things. So DOC is kind of trying to predict these mast events so that they can then go. And it's to the point where they're kind of almost doing it every year in some areas because the rats just are so damaging when they're in those big population sizes. And so a couple of marine system examples. So what we're seeing is changes in life history of shellfish and fish. Oceanus acidification caused by the uptake of carbon dioxide into the ocean is a real problem for calcifying organisms, so things like shellfish, and it's particularly at their early life history stages. So these organisms are not able to kind of produce their shells properly, and it just means that then the population collapses because they can't get the young through to a more mature phase. But there's also some effects on spawning and other kinds of processes of movement and stuff. So marine heat waves is a really big one that just in the last 2 to 3 years has been.
Hi, welcome, Mavis.
Kia ora. Could you mute, please? Hang on, I'm going to mute you. There you go. So yeah, marine heat waves, there's a lot of stuff coming out just in the last few years, particularly because of the bull kelp dieback, which is around the Canterbury region. But phytoplankton, seabirds, and also fish can also be influenced by these extreme events, which are a real problem. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the complicating factors of climate impacts. I want to just kind of talk a little bit more about that. So this figure here is from a 2018 paper that was looking at Australian systems, but it's relevant to lots of places. And what it's going through is kind of this idea of press and pulse disturbance. So for climate change, we can have these kind of low-level changes. So a gradual increase in average temperature is something that we could think of as being like a press disturbance. It's sort of happening quite slowly and gradually. Whereas a pulse disturbance might be something like a heat wave or a drought or a fire. These are the really kind of extreme and intense kind of disturbance events. And this is all happening together. So this figure kind of tries to bring that together. So the top line in the green is showing long-term climatic variability. So that might be over kind of years to decades. And then the next line in red is showing the short-term weather variability, which is those extreme events. So we're seeing these little blips. And like I said, that might be the heat waves occurring. And so the green line is sort of the natural variability that's kind of always been there. And the red is these extreme events. And then the blue line, the third one there, is shown as climate change. And so this is this gradual kind of increase in temperature. And if we put all three of those together, we get line D, which is the kind of what the system experiences. And so we can see that there's kind of the gradual increase plus the long-term variability and these extreme events. It's showing on here the kind of survivable extremes versus the extinction extremes. You can imagine that as those things add together, we're getting into more and more situations of extinction extremes. And then that bottom line is showing the population size. So after, early on in the process, when those extreme events happen, the population can recover. But as it keeps going, the population eventually just dies off completely because those extreme events are kind of extinction level extremes. And so the examples from this paper are from and you can
extreme climate impacts. It's like
you can see some images here of the things that are going on. But for instance, so the top left there is kelp forest collapse due to heat waves. We're also experiencing that here in Aotearoa. We've got fires, droughts, and then the kind of combinations of events where we've got a flood, which encourages lots of vegetation growth, and then a drought after that. And so there's a lot of fuel, and then there's a fire that comes through. So it's this kind of accumulation of lots of events happening as well. So we've potentially got some really complicated things to kind of detect and measure. And one of my messages is always that I think there's more stuff going on that we're not actually aware of. But there are lots of things that we are aware of that are reasonably simple to explain. So the direct impacts are the easiest to kind of, I guess, typify and understand. So these are some examples of when the climatic conditions are going to directly impact New Zealand species or systems. So I've already given you the example of the mast seeding in beech forests. This also happens in tussock grasslands in alpine areas. But another classic one is tuatara. So these have a response to the temperature conditions, the eggs kind of respond to the temperature conditions, where warmer conditions actually produces more male tuatara than female tuatara. So this will change the sex ratio of the populations. And if this happens too much, then there's not enough females to reproduce. So the modelling shows us at what temperature the populations will get into difficult situations. So tuatara currently kind of all very highly managed in small populations. Some of the offshore islands, those populations might be potentially vulnerable to these temperature increases. And if the populations are not kind of well looked after and monitored, then those populations could die off quite quickly as these temperature increases occur. So the tuatara situation is something that is known about and is predicted to happen, but it's not been measured as happening yet in the field. So it's one of those ones where we've got the good information, we can keep a good eye on it and intervene if things get too tricky. Now, the climate change effects, as well as there being all these, lots of different factors that can contribute, often what we're seeing here in Aotearoa is kind of these, an exacerbation effect, where we've got some kind of factor like invasive species, and that's the impacts of invasive species are exacerbated by climate change. And so we can end up with the climate change effects being indirect, interactive, or synergistic. So they're not just really simple direct processes, but they're really complicated. And this means it's very difficult to detect and to predict what might be going on. So indirect, we might be thinking about climate change operating through an intermediate factor. And so, for instance, an example of that might be we've got an increase in overwintering of invasive insects. And so those insects are able to kind of get into other areas. And then the insects themselves are the ones that then go and, attack plants or organisms. And so it's the indirect processes. You can see that climate change is affecting the insect, and then the insect goes on and does that effect. Interactive effects is where there's kind of operating together, and synergistic is sort of kind of similar. So an example of that is the thermal squeeze that I talked about in the alpine areas, where we've got the kind of predators and the climate change working together to be impactful on the bird species. So as I said, this is an exacerbation process, and in particular, habitat fragmentation and invasive species impacts are two of the main kind of issues in ecology that are sort of worsened by the climatic conditions. So some examples of indirect impacts. We can see this, one of my colleagues did an experiment in alpine areas for plants, and she looked at warming the plants. So she warmed kind of sort of groups of plants, small plants, in these sort of warming chambers in the field. And she found that when the native and invasive plants were in the warmed condition, there was much more overlap of their flowering time. So this meant that there was more competition for pollinators, and the prediction is that then the alpine native plants are potentially going to have a decline in their populations because they're not going to have as much reproductive output because they don't get as much pollination happening. So that's a really complex process to kind of detect and understand and also be able to predict. And it's an example of something that I think is probably happening a whole lot more that we're not even aware of. The second example there is around vegetation and fire feedback loops. So our flora here in Aotearoa doesn't have very good adaptations to fire, but the many invasive species that come from places like Australia, they do have good adaptations. So this means, for instance, that they are able to resprout after fire, or they're even stimulated to reproduce after fire. So if we have large-scale fires here in Aotearoa, our vegetation is not as able to recover, and it means that there's great opportunity for invasive weeds to kind of take over large areas. So gorse is an example of that. There's also the hakea that we see in the kind of Nelson region. There's a number of kind of particular species that are problematic in terms of fire. And the other issue around fire is that a lot of these weeds are then actually kind of highly flammable. And so then they're more likely to catch on fire, in following years. And so we just get this process of like the vegetation becoming more fire prone, and which is potentially very damaging. The last example I want to give is mudfish, and these live in Westport forests. Now, the mudfish actually just live in tip-up pools where trees fall over and they create a big hole in the ground, and that fills with water when it rains. And it's fascinating. I don't know how the fish get between the different pools, but somehow they do. So they live in these forest systems, but the forests are being cleared for living, and they're also being impacted by droughts. And so the tip-up pools, when there's dry periods, they fill up with debris, and so then they're not available for future years. And the with droughts occurring too, then the pools are not filling up as much. So there's this combination of the clearing of the forests and the droughts that are working together to operate that. The modelling shows that if it was just one or the other, the mudfish would be fine, but with both the droughts and the reduced number of pools because of logging, together those things are what cause the decline of the population. Okay, so we are doing a lot of work. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of thinking about climate change. There's a lot more that we could do. This is a paper we published last year just showing what it was a review of the literature, and we looked at sort of what's going on across marine, terrestrial and freshwater spaces. And so marine scientists have been thinking a lot more about climate change than freshwater and terrestrial scientists. The numbers of papers shown there, 60 papers about the process, but only 21 for freshwater and 18 for terrestrial. So a lot of space for more research to happen. In the same paper, we gave kind of a bit of an overview of what all of those impacts potentially are and how they fit across the marine terrestrial zones. I'm conscious that I'm kind of a little bit over time, so I might not go into the detail of that, but we'd be happy to kind of share that paper if anyone's interested. Now, actually, most of the research that's going on is looking at just really simple and direct. So those direct type processes, we're not doing a lot of research and indirect. So 86 of the papers are very simple, and then only 13 are looking at the more complicated type processes. So there's a lot of potential for complicated factors to be influencing our species and ecosystems. I do want to just quickly talk you through our key knowledge gaps that we identified in this paper. So the impact of extreme events, particularly fire, drought, floods and storms across freshwater, alpine and terrestrial zones. There's a lot more space to be thinking there. We also need to think about the vulnerability of rare ecosystems. So we've got tens of rare ecosystems that have arisen because of unique conditions here in Aotearoa. There's a really nice paper that came out about 15 years ago, just typifying all of those. It'd be great to go through that and think about which ones are most vulnerable. And the rare ecosystems are important because they've often got endemic species that are not found anywhere else. And they're often very vulnerable because they're in very small areas, so easy to kind of wipe out. Now, heat waves is something that we need to think about more, not just for ecosystems, but also for people. There's an interesting paper that came out last year that was assessing the suitability of retirement home type buildings in Tāmaki Makaurau for kind of heat conditions. And they found that about 2/3 of the buildings that they looked at were not going to be, well, in February, January.
It's here. It's on the chair in the basement.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry, just in February and January, these buildings are not meeting they get overheated already, and so under future climates, it's going to be a real problem. And of course, we know that older people are more vulnerable to heat conditions. And these are buildings that are meeting current building standards. So our building standards are not good enough, and we need to do something about that because it's middle-aged people like me in particular who are going to suffer as the climate gets worse. Okay, so the next one we've got here is thinking about ecosystem services and processes. So it's not just extinctions, it's also how do those different ecosystems operate. A lot of work to be done there. And then there's a real vulnerability across the world for Indigenous communities because they're often really relying on or they're really attached to landscapes and species and ecosystems. So here we need to think more about what does it mean for Māori, things like mihinga kai. There's research showing that certain shellfish, for instance, vulnerable to ocean acidification. There's lots of potential issues there. So we need to kind of be providing resourcing to Māori to kind of do the research and to do the management. So there's a lot of, that should be an important focus. So we put that right at the top. So we've got lots of questions, and I posed these questions to the Ecological Society last year when I gave a similar talk. We don't really have many options for mitigation, but we need to kind of think about what those are. What can we do? How do we future-proof our ecosystems? How do we make sure our conservation efforts are sustainable? And I think it's important to continue things like predator-free New Zealand, to continue working on invasive species, because those are the things we can probably have an effect on, but it's more challenging to kind of really make a change around climate change. And then how do we conserve rare and threatened species and ecosystems with limited funds? So there's a bit of work to be done around prioritisation, I think. Now, this figure is showing kind of the exposure to climate change across the bottom axis there, where we have low exposure through to high exposure. And then we have on the y-axis, the sensitivity going from low sensitivity to high sensitivity and also adaptive capacity. So on the kind of left-hand side of this graph, when we're in the kind of low exposure, we want to get into the preparedness state. So I think for a lot of systems here in Aotearoa, we should be doing more monitoring, looking at making sure that we've got some plans in place once climate change gets underway. And then across that diagonal arrow, there is some kind of options for things that can be done for mitigating. Ex situ conservation, which is things like zoos and botanic gardens. We can think about rewilding, assisting migration, species-specific management, habitat and landscape management. There's lots of different things that we kind of sort of can do, but some of them get really intensive, require a lot of intervention. So if I was thinking about kind of policy, what do we actually need? I think we need more monitoring networks. As I've been saying, I think there's a lot more going on that we don't know about. So these are the unknown unknowns, things that we don't even know we don't know about. So more monitoring, which we see in other parts of the world, would be a useful thing to do. More research to improve detection. It's a bit of a cliche, a researcher saying we need more research, but I do actually think in this space it's very important to say that. We need to make sure that ongoing conservation efforts are well resourced, and I would say control of invasive species is a big one there. The species that we already have here, and then we've got new ones coming too, so biosecurity really important. And then providing mana whenua with resources to protect ecosystems and species. I think we could do a lot more there. Just want to quickly show you some examples of what's done overseas that we don't have here.
Starting to run out of time.
Yeah, okay, sure. And so these are the long-term monitoring networks. These kinds of things allow us to predict into the future. So these are simulating increased carbon dioxide concentrations and what they might do. And then this is a kind of paper talking about ecotrons, which are showing they're sort of simulating future climates for better experimental work. These are massively expensive. I don't expect we'd ever have these here, but I think it's useful to just be aware of stuff that's going on around the world. And then I want to quickly mention the idea of nature-based solutions. I think these are fantastic. Always love getting out planting a tree, but we just need to be aware of the fact that under future climates, the planted trees can not survive. So on the right there, I've got some aerial photographs of, say, so this is a Ngāti Whātua area that's being restored, and in February 2020, all of those planted 5,000 planted plants all died because of that drought situation. So more work to be done there to make that effective. Just want to quickly acknowledge my collaborators, because this is this synthesis type work requires a lot of kind of